Chapter 1. The Voice in the Garden. The late May sunshine fell in dappled patterns across the well-tended lawn of Gossington Hall, illuminating the gathering of St. Mary Mead's most prominent citizens. Lady Amelia Carmichael's annual garden party had, over the years, become something of an institution in the village, a place where social standing was reaffirmed, gossip exchanged under the polite veneer of conversation, and the finest cucumber sandwiches in the county were served with Earl Grey tea in delicate bone china cups. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the shade of an ancient elm tree, her knitting needles clicking softly as her pale blue eyes observed the sight seen before her. At 83, her appearance was exactly what one would expect of an elderly spinster from an English village. Fluffy white hair, a gentle wrinkled face, and clothes that spoke of modest taste and careful preservation. Those who didn't know her often dismissed her as a harmless, perhaps slightly bewildered old lady. Those who did know her, however, recognized the sharp intelligence behind her faded blue eyes and the uncanny ability she possessed to see through the facades people presented to the world. "Another cup of tea, Miss Marple." Lady Carmichael herself approached, elegant in a powder-blue dress that complemented her silver hair. At 65, she remained a handsome woman, with the confident bearing of someone who had never questioned her place in the social hierarchy. "Oh, that would be most kind, thank you," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile, setting her knitting aside. "What a lovely afternoon you've arranged. The gardens are looking particularly splendid this year." Lady Carmichael beamed with pride. "We have our new gardener to thank for that. Young Mr. Reed has quite the touch with roses, though I must say he's a rather odd fellow, keeps to himself, hardly speaks to anyone. But then, good help is so difficult to find these days." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Indeed, though sometimes the quiet ones observe more than we might imagine." Perhaps Lady Carmichael's attention had already drifted to her other guests. "Oh, I must go greet the Hendersons. They've only just arrived, and Cynthia looks positively green with envy at Margaret's new hat. Do excuse me." As Lady Carmichael glided away, Miss Marple's gaze followed her progress across the lawn. The garden party represented a cross-section of village society. The wealthy Hendersons, newly arrived from London with their fortune made in manufacturing. Dr. Fellows, the village physician, deep in conversation with Colonel Edwards, retired from service in India. The vicar, Mr. Clement, and his wife Griselda, who was far too pretty and young for her husband, and hovering at the edges of the gathering. The servants and locals of lesser social standing who had been invited out of tradition rather than desire for their company. Among these was Daniel Reed, the gardener Lady Carmichael had mentioned, a tall young man with dark hair and intense eyes who stood awkwardly near the rose bushes, as if preferring the company of flowers to that of people. Miss Marple noticed how his gaze followed Catherine Denham, Lady Carmichael's niece, a slender girl of 23 with honey-coloured hair and a musical laugh that carried across the garden. Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who settled into the chair beside her with a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness you're here, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said. "These affairs can be so tedious without someone sensible to talk to. Have you heard about the famous soprano who's staying at Willow Brook Cottage? Lucia Varelli. They say she's hiding from some scandal in London." "I had heard something of the sort," Miss Marple admitted. Mrs. Granger at the post office mentioned that expensive parcels had been arriving, and the delivery boy said the lady had the most extraordinary collection of silk dresses. "Well, she's here today," Mrs. Bantry said with undisguised excitement, nodding toward a striking woman in her 40s, dressed in an elegant crimson ensemble that stood out among the pastel shades favoured by the village ladies. "Lady Carmichael invited her specially. Apparently, she's agreed to sing for us later." Lucia Varelli carried herself with the confident poise of someone accustomed to being watched. Her dark hair was styled fashionably, her makeup perhaps a touch too dramatic for a country garden party, but her smile was warm as she conversed with her hostess. Yet Miss Marple, watching carefully, noticed the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes frequently scanned the gathering, as if looking for someone, or perhaps wary of being seen. The afternoon progressed pleasantly. Tea was served, followed by champagne for those so inclined. Conversations ebbed and flowed around the garden. Miss Marple observed Catherine Denham attempting to engage the taciturn gardener in conversation, only to be interrupted by her mother, Mrs. Eleanor Denham, Lady Carmichael's younger sister, who steered her daughter firmly toward the company of Timothy Henderson, the manufacturing heir. As the sun began its descent, casting longer shadows across the lawn, Lady Carmichael tapped a spoon against her glass to gain everyone's attention. "My dear friends," she announced, "we have a special treat today. The renowned soprano Miss Lucia Varelli has graciously agreed to favour us with a song." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the gathering as Lucia Varelli moved to stand before them, her crimson dress catching the late afternoon light. She smiled, inclined her head in acknowledgment of the introduction, and then began to sing. Her voice rose pure and clear in the still air, a haunting melody that seemed to speak of longing and loss. The garden fell silent, conversations forgotten, as the beautiful, melancholy notes wrapped around the listeners. Even the birds seemed to pause their evening chorus to listen. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, allowing the music to wash over her. When she opened them again, her gaze fell upon Daniel Reed, the gardener. He stood frozen, his face drained of colour, his eyes fixed on the singer with an expression of such naked shock and recognition that Miss Marple felt a small chill run down her spine. The song built to its crescendo, Lucia Varelli's voice soaring impossibly high before falling, away to a whisper that seemed to shiver in the air. For a moment after she finished, no one moved or spoke. Then applause erupted, breaking the spell. As the guests crowded around to congratulate the soprano, Miss Marple's attention remained on Daniel Reed. The young man had disappeared into the shadows of the garden, his hurried departure noticed only by the elderly lady beneath the elm tree, and, she observed with interest, by Lucia Varelli herself, whose smile faltered for just a moment as her eyes followed his retreating figure. The shivering notes of the song seemed to linger in the air long after the applause had died away, a haunting prelude to events none of the assembled guests could yet imagine. Chapter 2. Whispers and Shadows. The garden party dispersed as evening approached, with guests drifting away in twos and threes, their conversation animated by the unexpected musical performance. Miss Marple declined Lady Carmichael's offer of a ride, preferring instead to walk the short distance back to her cottage. The mild May evening, with its lingering scent of roses and freshly cut grass, provided the perfect opportunity for reflection. "Jane, wait a moment," called Mrs. Bantry, hurrying to catch up. "I'll walk with you. Arthur's gone ahead with the car." She fell into step beside Miss Marple, her keen eyes bright with excitement. "What did you make of our opera singer? Rather out of place in St. Mary Mead, wouldn't you say?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "though people often come to villages like ours when they wish to escape something. Or someone," Mrs. Bantry added with relish. "Did you notice how she kept glancing around during tea, and that song so melancholy? Colonel Edwards told me it was about a lover's betrayal and a vow of vengeance. Quite dramatic for a garden party." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you happen to observe the gardener's reaction?" "The gardener? No, I can't say I paid him any attention at all." "Most interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "He seemed quite affected by the performance, almost as if the song held some particular significance for him." They paused at the crossroads where their paths would diverge. The evening shadows had lengthened, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of a piano, a halting melody that seemed to echo the haunting song from earlier. "That must be from Willow Brook Cottage," Mrs. Bantry observed. "Miss Forelli must be practising. Well, good night, Jane. Do come for tea tomorrow. We can discuss the party properly then." As Miss Marple continued alone toward her cottage, she found herself preoccupied with the curious tension she had witnessed between the gardener and the soprano. There had been recognition there, certainly, but something more. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Human nature, she reflected, often revealed itself in these unguarded moments when people believed themselves unobserved. The following morning dawned bright and clear. Miss Marple was tending to her garden when she heard excited voices from the lane. Her gardener's boy, Tom, appeared at the gate, breathless with news. "Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been a terrible to-do at Willow Brook Cottage. The famous singer-lady, she's been found dead." Miss Marple's hand stilled on her secretaire. "Dead? How dreadful! What happened, Tom?" "They're saying she took poison, miss. Dr. Fellows is there now, and Inspector Craddock has been called from Melchester. They say—" He lowered his voice dramatically. "They say it wasn't an accident." Miss Marple thanked him for the information, and once alone sat down heavily on her garden bench. The beautiful soprano, so full of life just yesterday, now silenced forever. She thought again of the song, that shivering, haunting melody, and the gardener's face as he listened. A premonition, perhaps, or something more troubling. By midday the news had spread through St. Mary Mead like wildfire. Miss Marple, visiting the post office, found Mrs. Granger in full flow. "Cyanide, they're saying," she whispered to Miss Marple. "In her evening cocoa. Inspector Craddock is questioning everyone who was at the garden party yesterday, and they've arrested that new gardener from Gossington Hall." "Daniel Reed?" Miss Marple asked, her interest piqued. "That's the one. Martha from the kitchen says they found a letter in Miss Forelli's room, mentioning him by name, and he was seen lurking near Willow Brook Cottage last night after the party." As Miss Marple walked home, she considered these developments. The arrest seemed hasty to her, too neat, perhaps. She remembered Catherine Denham's attempts to speak with the gardener, and her mother's swift intervention. And what of the song itself, with its theme of betrayal and vengeance? The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, but one that was still incomplete. That afternoon she received a visit from Inspector Craddock, a serious young man who had learned to value Miss Marple's insights from previous investigations. "I won't ask how you've already heard the details, Miss Marple," he said with a slight smile as he accepted a cup of tea. "News travels fast in St. Mary Mead." "Indeed it does, Inspector. And is it true you've arrested young Mr. Reed?" Craddock nodded. "We found him hiding in the woods near Willow Brook Cottage last night. He admits he knew Lucia Varelli, or rather, Lucia Reed. She was his stepmother." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "That would explain the recognition. There's more. Reed claims she abandoned him and his father 15 years ago, running off with a wealthy patron. His father never recovered, eventually taking his own life. Reed has been tracking her down for years, apparently." "A strong motive for murder," Miss Marple observed. "Precisely. And with his expertise in plants at Gossington Hall, he would have access to various poisons. It seems straightforward enough." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she resumed her knitting. "Perhaps. Though in my experience, Inspector, the straightforward explanation is rarely the correct one. Did you happen to speak with Catherine Denham? She seemed quite interested in Mr. Reed yesterday." Craddock looked surprised. "No, I haven't. Do you think she knows something?" "I couldn't say, Inspector, but I did notice her mother was most anxious to separate them. And Mrs. Denham spent quite some time in conversation with Miss Varelli during the party. They seemed familiar with one another." As Craddock departed, promising to follow up on her observations, Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the distant outline of Willowbrook Cottage. The case against Daniel Reed seemed strong, but something about it troubled her. The Shivering song still echoed in her memory, a melody that spoke of old wounds and unresolved pain. There were more secrets to uncover in this peaceful village, and Miss Marple suspected they ran deeper than anyone yet realized. Chapter 3. Family Portraits. The following morning, Miss Marple found herself invited to tea at Gossington Hall. Lady Carmichael's note, delivered by hand, had been brief but urgent. "My dear Jane, I would so value your company this afternoon. These dreadful events have quite shaken us all." The grand drawing-room at Gossington seemed subdued, the usual cheerfulness of its yellow silk curtains and flowered chintz somehow muted by recent events. Lady Carmichael herself looked tired, the careful composure she typically maintained now showing signs of strain. "It's all too awful," she said, pouring tea with a slightly trembling hand. "To think that our gardener, and that poor woman, I simply cannot believe it happened here, in St. Mary Mead." "It is most distressing," Miss Marple agreed gently. "I understand Mr. Reed had a personal connection to Miss Varelli." "So it seems." Lady Carmichael lowered her voice. "Inspector Craddock questioned me at length about him. I knew nothing of his background, of course. Mrs. Jennings at the agency in Melchester recommended him highly. Excellent references and a remarkable knowledge of horticulture. He seemed so quiet, so dedicated to the gardens. Who could have imagined such darkness in his past?" The door opened, admitting Eleanor Denham and her daughter Catherine. Both were dressed in subdued colours, as if already in mourning, though Miss Marple noted that while Mrs. Denham's face showed appropriate gravity, Catherine's eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Forgive our lateness, Amelia," Mrs. Denham said, taking a seat beside her sister. "Catherine was feeling unwell." "Perfectly understandable, my dear," Lady Carmichael said sympathetically. "You remember Miss Marple, of course?" Catherine nodded distractedly, her fingers worrying at a handkerchief in her lap. Miss Marple observed how the young woman seemed to avoid meeting anyone's gaze directly. "I was just telling Miss Marple about that dreadful business with Daniel Reed," Lady Carmichael continued. "Such a shock to discover his connection to Miss Varelli." At the mention of the gardener's name, Catherine's head jerked up, her knuckles whitening around the handkerchief. Miss Marple did not miss the warning glance her mother shot her. I hardly think we need discuss such unpleasantness," Mrs. Denham said firmly. "The man is in custody, and that's an end to it." "But is it?" Catherine spoke suddenly, her voice strained. "What if he's innocent? What if—" Catherine, her mother's sharp tone cut her off. "This is hardly appropriate conversation." An awkward silence fell, broken only by the delicate clink of Lady Carmichael's teacup against its saucer. Miss Marple, glancing around the room, noticed a photograph on the mantelpiece, a family group taken some years earlier, judging by Lady Carmichael's darker hair and the youthful appearances of Mrs. Denham, and a distinguished-looking man who must be Mr. Denham. "What a lovely photograph," Miss Marple commented, hoping to ease the tension. "Is that Mr. Denham? I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting him." A shadow crossed Mrs. Denham's face. "My husband passed away 3 years ago. A hunting accident." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured. "Please accept my belated condolences." "Thank you," Mrs. Denham replied stiffly. "It was a difficult time." "Father would have wanted the truth to come out," Catherine said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter the consequences." Mrs. Denham set down her teacup with unnecessary force. "Catherine, I think perhaps you should lie down. You're clearly not yourself today." As Catherine was led from the room, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of what appeared to be desperation in the young woman's eyes. Something was troubling her deeply, something beyond the normal shock of recent events. "Poor child," Lady Carmichael sighed after they had gone. "She's always been rather high-strung, much like her father. Thomas Denham was a brilliant man, but prone to dark moods. His death was a terrible blow." "I understand he was a music critic?" Miss Marple inquired, recalling a snippet of village gossip. "Yes, quite well respected in London circles. He had a particular interest in opera." Lady Carmichael hesitated, which makes this business with Lucia Varelli all the more strange. I wonder if they might have known each other professionally. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Did you happen to mention this to Inspector Craddock?" "No, it only just occurred, to me actually. Do you think it might be important?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Connections often prove significant in such cases." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slightly circuitous route home, one that led her past Willow Brook Cottage. The modest property was cordoned off with police tape, but she noticed Inspector Craddock emerging from the front door, looking preoccupied. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, spotting her. "Out for a walk?" "The doctor recommends it daily," she replied, with a gentle smile. "I see you're still investigating." Craddock nodded. "Something doesn't quite add up. Reed had opportunity and motive, certainly, but the evidence feels Too convenient. And now Catherine Denham has come forward, claiming he couldn't have committed the murder because he was with her at the time Varelli died. Was he indeed? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. She says they were walking in the woods near Gossington Hall from 9 until nearly midnight, discussing plants. Craddock sounded sceptical. Not the most convincing alibi, especially as she didn't mention it until this morning. Did you happen to find any information about a connection between Lucia Varelli and Thomas Denham? I understand he was a music critic with an interest in opera. Craddock looked surprised. As a matter of fact, yes. We found several reviews he wrote of her performances years ago, quite glowing, and there was a photograph in Varelli's possessions, her with Thomas Denham and Eleanor, taken in London about 18 years ago. They appeared quite friendly. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. And the poison, has it been identified? A plant-based toxin, as we suspected, derived from monkshood, which grows in several gardens locally, including at Gossington. As they parted ways, Miss Marple found herself piecing together the fragments of information. A soprano who abandoned her stepson and his father 15 years ago. A music critic and his wife who knew the singer around 18 years ago. A daughter determined to protect the gardener, despite her mother's obvious disapproval. And always, in the background, the haunting melody of that Shivering song. A song about betrayal and vengeance that had stirred such powerful emotions in those who heard it. The pattern was beginning to take shape, though crucial pieces were still missing from the puzzle. Miss Marple suspected that the next piece might lie in the past, a past that several people in St. Mary Mead seemed determined to keep buried. Chapter 4. Buried Notes. The village of St. Mary Mead buzzed with speculation. Despite Inspector Craddock's attempts to keep the investigation discreet, news of Catherine Denham's alibi for Daniel Reed had spread rapidly. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden with the morning paper untouched beside her, considered the implications. Young women in love often made foolish decisions. She had seen it countless times over the years. But there was something about Catherine's desperation that suggested more than romantic attachment. The gentle click of her garden gate interrupted her thoughts. Looking up, she was surprised to see Mrs. Bantry approaching, a manila folder clutched in her hands. "Jane, I've found something you simply must see," Mrs. Bantry said breathlessly, settling onto the garden bench. "Arthur was clearing out his study yesterday and came across these old programs from the Royal Opera House. He used to take me frequently before the war." She opened the folder, revealing a collection of yellowed programs. "Look at this one, from 18 years ago. A production of Puccini's Tosca, and see who was playing the lead." Miss Marple examined the program. There, listed as the soprano playing Floria Tosca, was the name Lucia Varelli. Arthur remembered her performance quite vividly, said she was magnificent, particularly in the famous aria Visi d'arte. But what's truly interesting is this. Mrs. Bantry pointed to another name listed among the patrons of the production. Thomas Denham, listed as a principal benefactor, along with his wife Eleanor. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured. "Did Colonel Bantry recall anything else about that production?" "Only that there was some gossip afterward about Varelli and one of her patrons, a married man. Nothing definite, but the London society pages hinted at an affair. Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. 18 years ago, she said thoughtfully. And Catherine Denham is 23, Mrs. Bantry finished, her eyes widening. Jane, you don't think— It's merely an observation, Miss Marple said carefully. But it might explain Mrs. Denham's anxiety when Catherine and Daniel Reed were speaking at the garden party. If there are secrets in the family's past, she would naturally wish to protect them. After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the vicarage. The Reverend Clement's wife, Griselda, had mentioned that the church choir had been rehearsing a piece for the upcoming summer concert, a piece that Lucia Varelli had offered to help them with before her untimely death. The vicarage kitchen was warm and fragrant with the scent of baking. Griselda, flour dusting her cheeks, welcomed Miss Marple warmly. "Leonard's in his study," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's been going through the music Miss Varelli recommended. Such a tragedy. She had promised to coach our soloist." "There's the piece she sang at Lady Carmichael's garden party?" Miss Marple inquired. "The very same. Il canto tremante. The Shivering song. Not very well known, apparently. She said it had personal significance for her." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea. "Did she elaborate on that significance?" "Not really. Only that it spoke of betrayal and its consequences. Rather melodramatic, I thought, but then artists often are." Griselda hesitated. "There was something else, though. The day after the garden party, she came to see Leonard. She seemed troubled, said she needed advice about a moral dilemma. Leonard didn't share the details with me, of course, but he mentioned that she was considering making some sort of confession or revelation." "How interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "And when was this?" "The morning before she died. Leonard suggested she take time to consider carefully before acting hastily." Griselda looked distressed. "He's been blaming himself, wondering if he could have prevented her death somehow." Miss Marple patted the younger woman's hand reassuringly. "No one could have foreseen what happened, my dear. Did Miss Varelli mention anyone else during her visit? Catherine Denham, perhaps?" Griselda looked, surprised. "No, but actually Catherine had come to see Leonard the day before. She was asking about the church records. Baptisms, specifically." This piece of information added another layer to Miss Marple's growing understanding. As she walked home through the village, she passed the local shop, where Martha, the maid from Gossington Hall, was selecting vegetables. The girl looked troubled, and Miss Marple, who had known her since she was a child, stopped to inquire after her welfare. "Oh, Miss Marple," Martha said, her voice low, "it's all so dreadful." And now Miss Catherine locked herself in her room after a terrible row with her mother. "A row? What about?" Martha glanced around before leaning closer. "It was about Mr. Reed, the gardener. Mrs. Denham was furious about Miss Catherine giving him an alibi, called her a fool, said she didn't understand what she was meddling with. And then—" Martha lowered her voice further. "Miss Catherine shouted something about knowing everything, about finding papers in her father's study before he died, something about her real mother." Miss Marple absorbed this information with a slight widening of her eyes. "Her real mother?" "That's what she said." Mrs. Denham went white as a sheet, and Lady Carmichael had to step in. They didn't realize I was clearing in the next room. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a pattern that Miss Marple had seen before in different guises. Human nature, after all, remained constant in its passions and its capacity for self-deception. That evening, she received a telephone call from Inspector Craddock. "Miss Marple, something's come up. We've found a letter in Varelli's effects. A recent one. It's from Catherine Denham, dated just a week ago, asking to meet privately. She signed it, 'Your daughter.'" Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "I see." "There's more. The autopsy results show that Varelli was approximately 3 months pregnant when she died." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting this new information with what she already knew. Catherine's desperate defence of Daniel Reed, Mrs. Denham's determination to suppress the truth, the shivering song of betrayal and vengeance. "Inspector," she said finally, "I believe we may be looking in the wrong direction entirely. The solution lies in the past, 18 years ago, to be precise, but the motive may be more immediate than we realized." As she replaced the receiver, Miss Marple gazed out her window at the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the twilight, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. A truth that would shake the foundations of one of St. Mary Mead's most respected families. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following morning brought a persistent drizzle to St. Mary Mead, casting a grey veil over the village. Miss Marple, umbrella in hand, made her way to the small parish church, where she had arranged to meet the Reverend Clement. The church was empty save for a single figure in the front pew, Catherine Denham, her head bowed in what might have been prayer or simple exhaustion. Miss Marple hesitated, then quietly took a seat beside the young woman. Catherine started at the interruption but relaxed slightly upon recognizing her companion. "Miss Marple," she acknowledged with a wan smile. "I suppose everyone in the village is talking about me now." "People will always talk, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently. "But what matters is the truth." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "The truth," she repeated bitterly. "I've spent my whole life not knowing it, and now that I do—" Miss Marple waited patiently as Catherine composed herself. "I found letters," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "After Father died, he kept them hidden in a compartment in his desk. Letters from Lucia Varelli, dating back years. She was my mother, and Mrs. Denham, my stepmother. She married Father when I was 5. After—" Catherine swallowed hard. "After they forced Lucia to give me up. Father was already married to Eleanor when he had the affair with Lucia. When Lucia discovered she was pregnant, they paid her to disappear, to give me up. Eleanor raised me as her own, and I never knew the difference until I found those letters." "And did you confront your stepmother with this discovery?" Catherine shook her head. "Not right away. I was too shocked, too angry. I wrote to Lucia instead. I had to know why she never came back for me, why she agreed to stay away." She fumbled in her handbag, producing a crumpled letter which she handed to Miss Marple. This was her reply. She asked to meet, to explain everything. She said there was more to the story than I knew, something that would change how I saw everything. Miss Marple scanned the letter, noting the elegant handwriting and the emotional undercurrent beneath the carefully chosen words. "And did you meet with her?" "Yes, the morning before the garden party. She told me—" Catherine's voice faltered. She told me she'd never stopped loving me, that giving me up was the greatest regret of her life. She said she was going to make things right, that there would be no more secrets. But then at the garden party, when I saw her speaking with Mother, with Eleanor, they seemed to be arguing. The church door creaked open, admitting Reverend Clement, who nodded gravely to them, both before disappearing into the vestry. Catherine glanced nervously after him. "I've been searching the church records," she confessed. "My birth certificate lists Eleanor as my mother, but I wanted to see the baptismal record. It's missing. The page for that month has been removed from the register." "A deliberate removal, perhaps," Miss Marple suggested carefully. Catherine nodded. "And there's something else. Daniel, Mr. Reed, he recognized Lucia immediately at the garden party. Not just as the famous soprano, but personally. Later, he told me everything. How she had been his stepmother, how she abandoned him and his father. It was such a strange coincidence that we both had a connection to her." "Perhaps not entirely coincidence," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Inspector Craddock mentioned that Lucia Varelli was with child when she died." Catherine's face paled. "Yes, she told me that too. She said it was why she had come back, why she needed to set things right before—" She broke off, shaking her head, but she wouldn't tell me who the father was, only that it complicated everything. As they exited the church, the rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh and the gravel path glistening. Miss Marple guided their walk toward the village green, away from potential eavesdroppers. Did Lucia mention anything about the Shivering song, its significance to her? Only that it told her story. A woman betrayed by her lover, who vows that the truth will eventually come to light. Catherine looked troubled. "Miss Marple, they're saying Daniel poisoned her with monkshood from the Gossington Gardens, but he couldn't have. He was with me that evening after the garden party. We walked for hours. He was helping me process what Lucia had told me. And yet someone administered the poison," Miss Marple said quietly. "Someone with access to Willow Brook Cottage who had reason to silence Lucia before she could reveal whatever truth she had returned to share." Catherine's steps faltered. "You don't think Mother wouldn't—" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that when people have kept secrets for many years, they often go to extraordinary lengths to prevent their exposure, particularly when those secrets threaten their position and security." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock waiting for her, his expression grave. "We've had to release Daniel Reed," he informed her as she invited him in. "His alibi checks out. Several witnesses saw him with Catherine Denham during the critical hours. But I'm afraid we've uncovered something else." He produced a small evidence bag containing a delicate silver locket. This was found in Eleanor Denham's dressing table, hidden in a false bottom of her jewellery box. Inside is a dried flower petal, monk's hood. Miss Marple examined the locket through the plastic. "Most interesting," she murmured, "and most revealing." "There's an inscription inside," Craddock continued. "To my dearest Elle, forever yours, T. We believe it was a gift from Thomas Denham to Lucia Varelli, which suggests that Eleanor Denham had reason to keep a memento of her husband's infidelity, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as a reminder." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined the will of Thomas Denham? Specifically, the provisions regarding Catherine's inheritance. Craddock looked startled. Not to my knowledge. Why? Because I believe we may find there the motive for a particularly cold-blooded murder. One that has its roots in events from 18 years ago, but was precipitated by more recent developments. She rose to stir the fire, her face thoughtful. And I think it's time we heard the full lyrics of the Shivering song. They may tell us more than anyone has realized. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The Melchester solicitor's office was housed in a Georgian building on the High Street, its brass nameplate gleaming in the afternoon sun. Hartfield, Graves and Partners, Est, 1887. Miss Marple, accompanied by Inspector Craddock, was shown into Mr. Graves' office with the deference accorded to police business. Mr. Graves, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an air of perpetual caution, listened attentively as Craddock explained their interest in Thomas Denham's will. Yes, I handled Mr. Denham's estate, he confirmed, pulling a file from his cabinet. A straightforward matter, for the most part. The bulk of his considerable assets were left to his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Denham, with a trust established for his daughter Catherine to come into effect on her 25th birthday or upon her marriage, whichever came first. And the value of this trust? Craddock inquired. Mr. Graves cleared his throat. Substantial. Approximately £200,000, including the London property and his collection of rare musical manuscripts. I see, Miss Marple murmured. And were there any unusual provisions? The solicitor hesitated, glancing between them. There was a codicil, added shortly before his death. It stated that should Catherine discover her true parentage before the age of 25, the trust would become immediately accessible to her, with Mrs. Denham retaining only a modest annuity. Craddock leaned forward. Her true parentage was explicitly mentioned? Not in detail. The document referred only to the circumstances of her birth as detailed in the sealed letter held in trust with this will. Mr. Graves adjusted his spectacles nervously. That letter was to be given to Catherine on her 25th birthday, regardless of other circumstances. "May we see this letter?" Craddock asked. "I'm afraid not. Mrs. Denham claimed it after her husband's death. As Catherine's legal guardian, she had the right to all documents pertaining to her daughter. She assured me she would preserve it for Catherine's 25th birthday, as stipulated." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought along out of habit, clicked softly as she processed this information. Most interesting. And when did Mrs. Denham claim this letter? Immediately after the funeral. She seemed quite insistent. They departed the solicitor's office. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. £200,000 is certainly a motive for murder. If Mrs. Denham learned that Lucia Varelli had told Catherine the truth, she stood to lose not only a considerable fortune, but also her position as Catherine's mother. Miss Marple completed his thought. And then there's the matter of Lucia's unborn child. Another potential heir to the Denham fortune, perhaps. You think the child was Thomas Denham's? It would explain Lucia's return after all these years, her determination to set things right, as Catherine put it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed in concentration. But there's something else, Inspector. Something about the timing. The garden party where Lucia sang her Shivering song. It was a deliberate choice, I believe, a message to someone present. Back in St. Mary Mead, they found the village abuzz with fresh gossip. Eleanor Denham had been seen driving away from Gossington Hall in great distress, and Lady Carmichael had taken to her bed with what was described as a nervous collapse. Miss Marple made her way to Gossington Hall, where she was greeted by a pale but composed Catherine. "I've confronted her," Catherine said without preamble, leading Miss Marple into the morning room. "Mother, Eleanor, about everything. The locket, the monk's hood, the missing letter from Father's will. She denied it all, of course, but then—" Her voice faltered. "Then?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "She said horrible things about Lucia. Called her a fortune hunter, a manipulator. Said she'd seduced Father, ruined their marriage, then abandoned me when a better opportunity came along." Catherine's hands trembled. "But that doesn't match what Lucia told me. She said she was forced to give me up, that they threatened to ruin her career if she ever tried to contact me." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her expression thoughtful. "And what of Lucia's recent pregnancy? Did you raise that subject with Mrs. Denham?" Catherine looked startled. "No, I couldn't bring myself to. It seemed too painful, somehow. Do you think it's relevant to her murder? I think everything is connected, my dear. The past and the present, the betrayals old and new." Miss Marple paused. "There's one aspect we haven't fully explored. The meaning of the Shivering song. You mentioned that Lucia told you it was about betrayal, but I wonder if there might be more to it." "There might be," Catherine admitted. "After she died, I went to Willow Cottage. The police had finished there, and I wanted to see where she had lived. I found the sheet music for Il Canto Tremante, with her annotations. The lyrics were about a woman scorned who returns years later, her heart no longer warm, but shivering with cold purpose. It spoke of justice delayed but not denied. And where is this sheet music now?" Catherine hesitated. "I kept it. It seemed important, a connection to her, to my real mother." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Martha, the maid, entered looking uncomfortable. "Excuse me, Miss Catherine, but Lady Carmichael is asking for you, and—" She glanced uncertainly at Miss Marple. "There's a Mr. Reed at the kitchen door. He says it's urgent he speaks with you." Catherine rose immediately. "Daniel! But why would he come here? If Eleanor returns, I believe Mr. Reed may have information vital to understanding this case," Miss Marple suggested. "Perhaps we should hear what he has to say." In the kitchen garden, Daniel Reed waited, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He straightened when he saw Catherine, relief flashing briefly in his eyes before returning to gravity. "I've remembered something," he said without preamble, "about the day my father died. He received a letter that morning. It upset him terribly. He burned it afterward, but not before I glimpsed the signature. It was from Lucia, saying she was returning to England." He turned to Miss Marple. "That was 3 years ago, just before Thomas Denham's death in that hunting accident." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. 3 years ago? You're certain?" "Absolutely. My father took his life the very next day. I blamed Lucia, thought her letter had pushed him over the edge. That's why I sought work at Gossington Hall when I heard rumours she was in the area. I don't know what I wanted. Answers, maybe. Or revenge. But not murder. Miss Marple said softly. No. Daniel's gaze met Catherine's. Never that. Whatever Lucia did to my father, to me, I couldn't take a life. As Catherine reached for his hand, Miss Marple observed them thoughtfully. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a pattern more complex and more tragic than anyone had yet realized. The timing of Thomas Denham's death, the missing letter from his will, Eleanor's desperate need to maintain her position, Lucia's return with news of another child. And beneath it all, the shivering song of justice long delayed. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that it's time we spoke with Lady Carmichael. I suspect she knows more about these events than she has revealed. Chapter 7. Another Twist Lady. Carmichael's bedroom was shrouded in half-darkness, heavy curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. She lay propped against pillows, a frail figure in a bed that seemed too large for her diminished presence. As Miss Marple and Catherine entered, her eyes flickered open, revealing a gaze sharp with fever or fear. "Amelia," Catherine said gently, taking her aunt's hand, "Miss Marple would like to speak with you about Lucia Varelli." A tremor passed through Lady Carmichael's body. "I've been expecting this," she whispered. "Ever since that dreadful song at the garden party. She chose it deliberately, you know, to remind us, to threaten us." Miss Marple settled into a chair beside the bed. "Remind you of what, Lady Carmichael?" she asked softly. "The past? What we did?" Lady Carmichael's voice strengthened slightly. "What Eleanor insisted we do." "To Lucia Varelli?" Lady Carmichael nodded, her gaze shifting to Catherine. "I'm so sorry, my dear. We thought it was for the best, for everyone. Thomas was besotted with her, you see. This brilliant young soprano, so beautiful, so talented. Eleanor had been unable to have children, and their marriage was difficult. When Lucia became pregnant, it seemed like the perfect solution." "Solution?" Catherine echoed, her voice hollow. "Eleanor would raise the child as her own. Thomas would end the affair. Lucia would receive enough money to establish herself abroad. A clean break." Lady Carmichael's fingers plucked restlessly at the bedspread. "I helped arrange it all. The private birth, the paperwork, the payments. It seemed so tidy, so civilized, until Lucia decided to return." Miss Marple prompted. "Yes, 3 years ago. She wrote to Thomas, said she regretted giving up her child, wanted to meet Catherine. Thomas was distraught. He'd kept his promise, never contacted her again. But he'd never stopped loving her either. He told Eleanor he was going to tell Catherine everything, that it was time for the truth. And then he died in a hunting accident," Miss Marple observed quietly. Lady Carmichael's eyes filled with tears. It was a terrible shock. Eleanor was with him when it happened. They were alone. The rest of the hunting party had moved ahead. She said his gun discharged accidentally as he was climbing over a stile. A heavy silence filled the room. Catherine had gone very still, her face pale as marble. "After Thomas died," Lady Carmichael continued, "Eleanor showed me a letter from Lucia. Recent, angry, demanding. She said Lucia was threatening to expose everything, to ruin us all. I helped her again. We wrote back, pretending to be Thomas, saying he would meet her demands as long as she stayed away a little longer. We sent money." She closed her eyes briefly. "It bought us 3 years. And then Lucia discovered the truth, Miss Marple said. That Thomas was dead, that she had been deceived again. Yes, I don't know how. She simply appeared in the village, took Willow Brook Cottage. When I saw her at the garden party, I nearly fainted. And that song, that terrible accusing song. Lady Carmichael turned to Catherine, her expression pleading. You must understand, my dear. Eleanor was desperate to keep you, to protect Thomas's reputation, the family name. She's not a bad person, just frightened. Catherine stood abruptly. Frightened enough to commit murder, to poison the woman who gave birth to me, my real mother. Catherine, please, no! Catherine's voice was firm. No more excuses, no more lies. She turned to Miss Marple. If what she's saying is true, if Eleanor knew my father wanted to tell me the truth before he died, if she was alone with him when his accident happened, then it raises troubling questions. Miss Marple agreed gently. Inspector Craddock will need to speak with Lady Carmichael. As they left the bedroom, they found Daniel Reed waiting in the corridor, his expression grave. There's something else, he said in a low voice. The sheet music Catherine found. May I see it? Catherine led them to her room, retrieving the music from a drawer in her writing desk. Daniel examined it carefully, his fingers tracing the annotations. This handwriting, he said finally. It's not Lucia's. What do you mean? Catherine asked, frowning. It must be. It was among her things. I know Lucia's handwriting. I saved the few letters she wrote to my father. Daniel shook his head. This is similar, a good imitation, but it's not hers. These annotations were added by someone else. Miss Marple leaned forward to examine the sheet music. How very interesting! And were there any other papers in Lucia's cottage? Letters, perhaps, or a diary? The police would have those now, Catherine replied. But I did notice something odd. Her desk had been disturbed. Drawers left open, papers scattered. I assumed the police had searched it. Or perhaps someone else was looking for something, Miss Marple mused. Something important enough to risk entering a house that was under police investigation. A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha entered looking anxious. Miss Catherine, there's a telephone call for you. It's Dr. Fellows. He says it's urgent. Catherine returned minutes later, her face ashen. It's Eleanor, she said. She's been found unconscious at the river bridge. They've taken her to the hospital, an apparent suicide attempt. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Daniel. Did Dr. Fellows say anything else? Was there a note? Yes, clutched in her hand. It simply said, "Forgive me." Catherine's voice trembled. I should go to her. Whatever she's done, she raised me. She's the only mother I've ever known. As Catherine and Daniel left for the hospital, Miss Marple remained at Gossington Hall. Something about this latest development troubled her. It felt too convenient, too theatrical. Eleanor Denham had struck her as a woman of strong character, determined to protect her position. Would such a woman attempt suicide when cornered, or would she fight? Remembering the disturbed desk at Willowbrook Cottage, Miss Marple decided to examine Thomas Denham's study. Perhaps there were answers to be found in the place where Catherine had discovered the fateful letters that had set these tragic events in motion. The study was a masculine room, with leather-bound books lining the walls and a massive oak desk dominating the space. Miss Marple began a methodical examination, starting with the desk. The secret compartment Catherine had mentioned was cleverly concealed in the back of a drawer, but now stood empty. As she continued her search, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a photo album on one of the shelves. Opening it, she found family photographs. Thomas, Eleanor, and Catherine at various ages. A happy family to all appearances. But at the back of the album, partially hidden beneath the lining paper, was another photograph. Thomas Denham with a dark-haired woman who was unmistakably Lucia Varelli, standing in front of a country cottage. With a small shock, Miss Marple recognized the distinctive porch of Willow Brook Cottage. The pieces were coming together, forming a pattern more sinister than even she had imagined. As she replaced the album, her eye caught a glint of metal beneath the desk. Kneeling with some difficulty, she retrieved a small golden key that had fallen into a crack between the floorboards. Miss Marple studied the key thoughtfully. It was too small for a door, perhaps for a jewellery box or a diary. As she slipped it into her pocket, she heard a car approaching outside. Through the window, she saw Inspector Craddock arriving, his expression grim. The case was reaching its climax, and Miss Marple sensed that the final revelation would be both shocking and, in its way, inevitable. A tragedy born of love, jealousy, and the desperate need to protect long-buried secrets. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. A suicide attempt seems rather convenient, Inspector Craddock remarked, as he and Miss Marple sat in the morning room at Gossington Hall. Especially as our evidence against Mrs. Denham was mounting. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, turning the small golden key over in her fingers. And particularly troubling given the similarities to Thomas Denham's death, another apparent accident occurring just as secrets threatened to emerge. Dr. Fellows said she'll recover. Apparently, she didn't take enough pills to do serious harm. Craddock's expression was sceptical. For someone determined to end her life, she was remarkably imprecise, which suggests that ending her life may not have been her primary objective. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes were thoughtful. "Inspector, I believe it's time we visited Willow Brook Cottage again. This key may open something of importance there." The cottage stood silent in the afternoon sunlight, its windows blank and staring. Inside, the rooms remained as Lucia Varelli had left them, though now marked by the methodical disturbance of police investigation. The living room contained a small upright piano, sheet music still open upon it, Il Canto Tremante, the shivering song that had echoed through the garden party. Daniel Reed says these annotations aren't in Lucia's handwriting, Miss Marple explained, showing Craddock the peculiar markings on the music. Someone wished to emphasize certain aspects of this song, its themes of betrayal and vengeance. But why? What purpose would that serve? To send a message, perhaps, or to establish a particular narrative. Miss Marple moved to the desk in the corner, examining it carefully. Catherine mentioned this had been disturbed. Drawers left open, papers scattered. The desk was a delicate writing table with several small drawers. Miss Marple tried the key in each lock, finding no match. Frowning slightly, she surveyed the room again. Her gaze fell upon a small wooden jewellery box on the dressing table. The key turned smoothly in its lock. Inside lay several pieces of costume, jewellery, unremarkable save for a silver locket identical to the one found in Eleanor Denham's possession. Beneath the jewellery rested a small leather-bound diary. "Most illuminating?" Miss Marple murmured. opening the diary carefully. "Lucia's journal, I believe. And look here, entries from 3 years ago, around the time of Thomas Denham's death." Craddock leaned forward eagerly as Miss Marple read aloud. "April 15th. Letter from T today, after all these years. He says he will tell C everything, that we can finally be together. He suggests Willow Brook as our meeting place. How fitting. Where? It all began. Willow Brook," Craddock repeated. "This cottage. Yes, note the photograph I found in Thomas's study. They had been here before." Miss Marple turned more pages. "April 18th. Devastating news. T is dead. A hunting accident, they say. I cannot believe it. Was it truly an accident? The timing is too convenient. I fear the worst." Craddock's expression darkened. She suspected foul play even then. "Indeed," Miss Marple continued reading. "April 30th. Letter from E today. Not T as I'd hoped. She knows everything. Threatens to destroy my career if I ever contact C. Claims T never wanted to see me again. That his letter was a momentary weakness. Can this be true? I don't believe it." She turned more pages, skimming entries that documented Lucia's doubt, grief, and eventual determination to discover the truth. The final entries were from recent weeks. May 1st, this year. I've taken Willow Brook Cottage. They don't know I'm here yet. Soon I will see C, tell her everything. And then justice, at last, for T and for myself. Miss Marple looked up at Craddock. May 10th. C came today. So beautiful, so like her father. She knows the truth of her birth now, but not all. Not about what really happened to T. I must be careful. E is watching. And the final entry, Craddock asked. May 12th. The garden party tomorrow. Lady C has invited me to sing. I've chosen Il Canto Tremante. They will understand its meaning afterward. I will tell C everything, including about the baby. T's last gift to me, conceived during our brief reunion before his death. After all these years, his child will be born, and the truth will no longer be buried. Miss Marple closed the diary gently. There you have it, Inspector. Lucia was carrying Thomas Denham's child, a child conceived shortly before his death 3 years ago, which means Thomas and Lucia did meet again, despite what Lady Carmichael claimed, Craddock said slowly. And if Eleanor discovered this, it would give her not one, but 2 powerful motives for murder. Both then and now, Miss Marple completed his thought. A husband planning to leave her for his former lover, and later, that same lover returning with a child that could threaten Catherine's inheritance. As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple paused by the piano, her fingers lightly touching the keys. One thing still troubles me, Inspector. This edition of Il Canto Tremante. It's quite rare, I understand. How did Lucia come to possess it? And why would someone alter the annotations? Back at Gossington Hall, they found Catherine returned from the hospital, her face drawn with exhaustion. Eleanor is awake, she reported. She's asking for me, but I don't know if I can face her yet. I believe you should, Miss Marple said gently. But before you do, there's something you should know. She handed Catherine the diary. This belonged to your mother, your birth mother. It contains truths that may be painful, but which you deserve to know. As Catherine began to read, Miss Marple took Daniel Reed aside. "Mr. Reed, you mentioned your father received a letter from Lucia 3 years ago, shortly before his death. Do you recall the exact date?" Daniel frowned in concentration. "Mid-April, I believe, the 15th or 16th. "Just before Thomas Denham's death," Miss Marple noted. "And you're certain it was from Lucia?" "Absolutely. I saw her signature." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "I believe your father's suicide may be connected to Thomas Denham's death, in ways we haven't yet understood. Was there anything else unusual you recall from that time? Visitors, perhaps, or phone calls?" Daniel hesitated. There was one thing. A woman came to see him the day after he received the letter. Elegant, expensively dressed. They argued. I couldn't hear what about, but afterward he seemed broken somehow. That was the night he took his life. Could you identify this woman if you saw her again? Daniel nodded slowly. "I believe so. I only glimpsed her briefly, but—" He was interrupted by a cry from Catherine, who had turned pale as she read the diary. "This can't be true," she whispered. "A baby! My father's child! Lucia was carrying my half-sibling when she died." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "I'm afraid so, my dear, and I believe that knowledge was what sealed her fate. Someone could not allow that child to be born." Catherine looked up, her eyes suddenly sharp with understanding. "The will," she said. "Father's will. If another legitimate child of his were born, the inheritance would be divided," Miss Marple confirmed, "and questions would inevitably arise about the circumstances of Thomas Denham's death 3 years ago." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant sound of a car approaching. Inspector Craddock moved to the window. "It's Lady Carmichael," he reported, "and she's not alone. Eleanor Denham is with her." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her eyes took on a determined glint. "How very interesting," she said softly. "It seems our final confrontation is about to begin." Chapter 9. The Reveal. The drawing-room at Gossington Hall seemed to shrink with tension as Eleanor Denham entered, supported by Lady Carmichael. Eleanor looked frail, her face pallid and drawn, yet there was a strange determination in her bearing, as though she had passed through some internal struggle and emerged with a decision. "Catherine," she said softly, her gaze fixing on her daughter. "You've read it, haven't you? Lucia's diary." Catherine nodded, unable to speak, the diary clutched tightly in her hands. Eleanor sank into a chair, her movements careful and deliberate. "Then, you know about the child," she continued, her voice eerily calm. "Your father's child, conceived when he betrayed me yet again, after promising for years that their affair was over. Mrs. Denham," Inspector Craddock began, "I must caution you." "Oh, there's no need, Inspector." Eleanor waved away his concern with a brittle smile. "I'm quite past caution now. Let the truth come out at last. Isn't that what everyone wants?" "Decatur," Marple observed Eleanor carefully, noting the feverish brightness in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, not entirely attributable to her recent suicide attempt, she suspected. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you might tell us what happened 3 years ago, when your husband received a letter from Lucia Varelli." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Miss Marple, a flicker of wariness crossing her features. "You know about that?" We know that Thomas planned to meet with Lucia, to tell Catherine the truth about her parentage, Miss Marple said. And we know that shortly. Afterward he died in what was described as a hunting accident. A tense silence filled the room. Lady Carmichael had gone very still, her face turned away from the others. "It was an accident," Eleanor said finally, her voice hollow. "We were alone, yes. He was distraught, careless. His gun discharged as he was climbing over a stile. I tried to save him, but—" She shook her head. "No one would believe me now. Of course, not after everything else." "Including Lucia's death?" Craddock asked quietly. Eleanor's expression hardened. "Lucia was a manipulator, a destroyer. She took Thomas from me, then abandoned Catherine, only to return years later demanding her child back. And then, after Thomas died, to discover she was carrying his child." Her voice broke. "Another Denham heir, born of their betrayal. I couldn't allow it. So you poisoned her," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You killed my mother. I protected you." Eleanor's composure cracked suddenly. "Everything I've done has been to protect you, to preserve what's rightfully yours. The fortune, the position, the name, all of it would have been threatened by that woman and her child." "And what of my father's death?" Catherine pressed, her voice stronger now. "Was that truly an accident?" Before Eleanor could answer, Daniel Reed stepped forward, his face pale with shock. "It was you," he said quietly. "The woman who came to see my father the day before he took his life. I didn't recognize you at first. It's been years, and you were dressed differently. But it was you." Eleanor's eyes widened in momentary surprise before her features settled into resignation. "James Reed?" she said softly. "Yes, I went to see him. I had to know if it was true, if Lucia had contacted him as well." "What happened?" Miss Marple prompted. "He confirmed it, said Lucia had written to him, told him she was meeting Thomas at Willow Brook Cottage, that they planned to start anew, to tell Catherine everything." Eleanor's laugh was bitter. The faithful gardener, still in love with the woman who had abandoned him and his son. He was going to help them, help destroy everything I'd built, so you went to confront Thomas, Miss Marple said quietly. "Not during a hunting expedition, I suspect, but at Willowbrook Cottage, where he was meeting Lucia." Eleanor's face went very still. "How could you possibly know that? The photograph in Thomas's study. It showed him with Lucia at Willowbrook Cottage, a meaningful place to them both. The perfect meeting spot for a rekindled romance. I followed him there," Eleanor admitted, her voice barely audible. "I saw them together. Thomas promised he was leaving me, taking Catherine. He said he'd never loved me, that our marriage had been a mistake from the beginning." Her hands twisted in her lap, knuckles white. "I took his hunting rifle from the car. I only meant to frighten him, to make him see reason. But when he turned away, dismissing me, choosing her yet again—" She closed her eyes. "I didn't plan it, but I didn't stop it either. And James Reed?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with pain. "Why did he take his life?" "Because he witnessed it," Lady Carmichael said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "He was there, wasn't he, Eleanor? Working in the gardens at Willowbrook." All eyes turned to Lady Carmichael, who had risen from her seat, her aristocratic composure now replaced by grim understanding. James Reed saw what happened, she continued. He knew the truth about Thomas's death. When Eleanor discovered this, she gave him a choice, silence or destruction. She threatened to implicate him as an accessory, to ruin his name and his son's future. Amelia, don't, Eleanor pleaded. No more lies, Eleanor. I've helped you conceal the truth for too long. Lady Carmichael turned to Miss Marple. I suspected, you see. Not at first. I believed her story about the hunting accident. But later, when I saw her reaction to the news of Lucia's pregnancy, I knew then what she was capable of. Yet you said nothing, Craddock observed. I was complicit from the beginning, Lady Carmichael admitted, in separating Lucia from her child, in deceiving Catherine all these years. I told myself I was protecting my family, but in truth I was protecting myself from scandal. My silence after Thomas's death was more of the same. She looked at Catherine with genuine regret. I am deeply sorry, my dear. Catherine sat frozen, absorbing these revelations with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. Daniel had moved to stand behind her chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in silent support. And Lucia's death? Miss Marple asked softly. The monkshood poison? From the garden, Eleanor said dully. I know the plants well enough. It wasn't difficult to prepare. I visited her at Willow Brook, brought her tea, a peace offering, I called it. I said we should discuss Catherine's future calmly, as the two women who loved her most. The locket with the monkshood petal, Craddock said. Why keep such damning evidence? Eleanor smiled faintly. A memento of Thomas, of Lucia, of what they forced me to become. I kept Thomas's gift to her as a reminder of the price of betrayal. As Craddock moved to formally arrest Eleanor Denham, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the sheet music of Il Canto Tremante that Catherine had placed on the table. The annotations, which Daniel had identified as forgeries, suddenly made sense to her. It was you who marked the song, she said to Eleanor. You wanted Lucia to sing it at the garden party, to make her appear threatening, vengeful. You were already planning her murder, creating a narrative of a woman consumed by bitterness, who might plausibly take her own life when her plans for revenge failed. Eleanor didn't deny it. She deserved to sing her own requiem, she said quietly. One last performance before the final curtain. As Eleanor was led away, the shivering notes of that fateful song seemed to echo through the room, a melody of betrayal, vengeance, and tragedy that had claimed 3 lives and forever altered those who remained. Chapter 10. Aftermath. A week had passed since Eleanor Denham's arrest. The village of St. Mary Mead, initially shocked into hushed whispers by the revelations of murder and deception, had gradually returned to its usual rhythm of daily life. The dire scandal would not be forgotten. It would provide material for gossip for years to come. But the immediate sense of disruption had begun to fade. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the early summer sunshine. Her roses were blooming particularly well this year, their fragrance sweet on the warm air. She had been working on a complex piece of knitting, a christening shawl of delicate pattern, but her hands had stilled as her mind drifted back to the events of the past week. The click of her garden gate roused her from her thoughts. Inspector Craddock approached, looking more relaxed than she had seen him since the investigation began. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he greeted her, accepting her invitation to join her on the garden bench. "I thought you might like to know that Eleanor Denham has made a full confession. She'll stand trial for the murders of Thomas Denham and Lucia Varelli. The evidence is overwhelming. There's little doubt about the outcome." "Poor woman," Miss Marple said softly, so consumed by jealousy and fear of losing her position that she became capable of terrible acts. "You suspected her from the beginning, didn't you?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not from the very beginning, no. But certain inconsistencies began to emerge. The convenient timing of Thomas Denham's death. The peculiar reaction of Daniel Reed to Lucia's song. It reminded me of something that happened in the village years ago. The baker's wife, Mrs. Ellington, poisoned her husband when she discovered he was planning to leave her for the young woman who worked in their shop. Afterward, she maintained such a convincing facade of grief that no one suspected her for months. Human nature remains constant," Craddock observed with a slight smile. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "The desire to possess, to control, and the fear of losing what one believes one is entitled to can drive people to desperate acts. And Lady Carmichael, will charges be brought against her? I understand she's cooperating fully with the investigation. Her complicity after the fact in concealing the truth about Thomas Denham's death is serious, certainly. But given her age and her eventual willingness to speak the truth," Miss Marple sighed, "the courts may show leniency." "And what of Catherine and Daniel Reed?" Craddock asked. "Have you seen them since the arrest?" "Catherine called on me yesterday," Miss Marple replied. "She's decided to sell Gossington Hall, too. Many painful memories, she says. But she's keeping Willow Brook Cottage. She feels a connection to Lucia there, a chance to know the mother she never had the opportunity to meet in life. And her relationship with Reed, developing, I believe, though both have suffered significant traumas. They share a unique bond, both having lost parents to Eleanor Denham's actions, both having been deceived about their pasts." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Catherine mentioned that Daniel has been helping her plant a memorial garden at Willow Brook. Healing comes in many forms." Craddock nodded thoughtfully. "There's one aspect of the case I'm still puzzled by. The sheet music for Il Canto Tremante. How did Eleanor obtain it, and why go to the trouble of forging annotations?" "Ah," Miss Marple's eyes brightened with the pleasure of explanation. "The music itself wasn't difficult for Eleanor to obtain. Thomas Denham had been a collector of rare musical manuscripts. It was likely among his collection. As for the annotations, I believe Eleanor wanted to emphasize certain elements of the song, the themes of betrayal and vengeance, to create the impression that Lucia had returned seeking revenge, making her appear threatening, creating a potential motive for suicide when she planned to murder her," Craddock concluded. "Precisely. Eleanor was clever, methodical. She prepared her narrative carefully, ensuring that if suspicion did fall on her, she could portray Lucia as a vengeful woman who had threatened the family's peace and possibly taken her own life when her plans failed." They were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Bantry, who hurried through the garden gate with the eagerness of someone bearing fresh news. "Jane, have you heard? They found a letter from James Reed, Daniel's father, written the day he died. It was hidden in the binding of an old gardening book. Daniel discovered it while clearing out his father's cottage." "A suicide note?" Craddock asked sharply. "Not exactly," more of a confession or a testimony. He wrote about what he'd witnessed at Willow Brook Cottage, Thomas Denham's murder by Eleanor. He described how she threatened him afterward, how she claimed she would implicate him as an accomplice if he spoke out. Mrs. Bantry shook her head sadly. The poor man felt trapped, unable to live with what he knew, but unwilling to risk his son's future by revealing the truth. Another piece of evidence against Eleanor, Craddock noted. And vindication for James Reed, Miss Marple added softly. His son will know now that his father wasn't simply weak, but caught in an impossible situation. As Mrs. Bantry settled into detailed account of the village's reaction to these latest developments, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Catherine and Daniel. Two young people united by loss and deception, now facing the possibility of building something new from the ruins of their family's tragedies. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the churchyard, where she placed a small posy of flowers on the grave of Thomas Denham. The truth of his death had been revealed at last, but at a terrible cost. As she straightened, she noticed two figures in the distance, standing by the lich gate, Catherine and Daniel, their heads close together in conversation. Catherine held a single rose, perhaps intending her own act of remembrance. The past could not be changed, but Miss Marple took some comfort in the resilience of the human spirit, its capacity to seek truth, to find connection, and to begin again, even after the most devastating betrayals. As she made her way home, the distant notes of a piano drifted from the open windows of Willow Brook Cottage. Someone was playing Il Canto Tremante. But the shivering song of vengeance now seemed transformed, its haunting melody a requiem for those lost and a tentative hymn to what might yet be salvaged from their legacy. The mysteries of Willow Brook had been solved, the secrets of the past dragged painfully into the light. Yet Miss Marple knew that human nature would continue its complex dance of love and betrayal, nobility and weakness, kindness and cruelty. And she would continue to observe, to understand, and occasionally, when called upon, to illuminate the shadows where truth lay hidden.